On April 13, 2026, a group of government evaluators in the United Kingdom published results from a test that had never been possible before. They had taken an AI model, one its creator had announced in the very same press release was too dangerous to deploy, and run it through the hardest cybersecurity evaluation they had. Expert-level capture-the-flag challenges, the kind designed to separate professional penetration testers from amateurs. The kind where, until just 1 year before, every AI system ever tested had scored exactly 0. Not low, 0. No model had ever completed any of these tasks. This one completed 73% of them. Think about what that gap means. The previous benchmark was 0, not 5%, not 20. 0 was the floor for every model, from every lab, for every year the test had been run. And then, not gradually, not through a slow climb, 73% all at once. But that is not the number I want you to hold on to. What I want you to remember, for the next hour, is what happened on a Friday afternoon, 2 months later. A letter arrived, a phone call was made, and at 21 minutes past 5 in the afternoon, Eastern Time, every user on Earth was cut off. Researchers, developers, companies that had built entire products on top of this technology. Gone that same night. No warning, no transition period. Global silence. That is where this story ends. But to understand why it happened, to understand why that shutdown was, in some ways, the logical conclusion of everything that came before, you need to understand what this model could actually do. There are 5 things I want to walk you through. They happened in sequence across about 10 weeks, and each one makes the next feel more inevitable in retrospect. The first is an announcement that had never been made before by an AI company. The second is a government evaluation that redefined what the word capability means in this context. The third involves software vulnerabilities running right now, as you watch this, on devices exactly like yours. The fourth is a product release that was supposed to make all of that safe. And the fifth is the 48 hours in which that safety architecture collapsed and the chain of events that followed. I went into this expecting a story about a jailbreak, about a technical failure in a safety system and a government overreacting to it. What I found is something harder, something that has no clean fix and no obvious ending. On April 7th, 2026, Anthropic did something that had never happened before at the frontier of AI development. They announced a new model, their most powerful, and in the same announcement said they were not going to release it. The model was called Claude Mythos. And their public statement was direct. The model's capabilities had led the company to decide against making it generally available. Instead, they were deploying it only through a narrow, vetted defensive program called Project Glasswing, a collaboration with trusted security partners aimed at using the model's abilities to find and disclose software vulnerabilities before attackers could exploit them. Now, AI labs announce powerful models constantly. That is not unusual. What is unusual, what had never happened before at this scale, is a company standing in front of the world and saying, "We built this, and we are not giving it to you because it is too dangerous." That sentence, which Anthropic's team had clearly thought carefully about, was an admission without precedent. And the specificity of what they admitted matters. They were not worried about some vague, long-run risk. They were not concerned about alignment in the abstract or about whether future models might one day develop problematic goals. The capability they identified was concrete, immediate, and quantifiable. Mythos could find security vulnerabilities in software, real software, running on real machines, at a pace and scale that no AI had managed before. And not just find them, build working exploit code from them, autonomously, without a human guiding each step. To understand why that is qualitatively different from what AI models had done before, you need to understand a little bit about how vulnerability research works. Finding a security flaw in a piece of software is hard. The software that runs the systems we depend on, operating systems, web browsers, the protocols that connect devices to networks, is enormously complex. Auditing it for flaws requires deep expertise in the specific architecture of the system, patience across weeks or months, and the ability to hold an enormous amount of context in your head simultaneously while tracing execution paths through code. It is skilled, specialized, expensive work. Historically, it has been rate-limited by the number of people who can do it well. There are only so many qualified vulnerability researchers. Most of them work for security companies, governments, or the software companies themselves. Finding 0 days, flaws the vendor does not yet know about, requires even more skill because you are not working toward a known answer. You are searching an enormous problem space for something you do not know the shape of yet. An AI that could do this autonomously, quickly, across multiple software targets simultaneously would not be a marginal improvement on human researchers. It would be a different kind of entity entirely. The economics would shift. You would no longer be constrained by human expertise, human time, or human attention. You could run the search continuously and critically. Anyone who had access to such a model could run that search, not just the organizations and governments that currently employ the experts who can do it. Anthropic understood this. Project Glasswing was their answer. Use the capability defensively under controlled conditions with oversight. Commit resources to disclosing what the model finds. Make the first mover advantage work for defenders, not attackers. It was a considered response to a genuine dilemma, and it was also, unavoidably, the most public possible announcement of exactly what the model could do. 6 days after Anthropic made that announcement, the UK government published its independent assessment. The UK AI Security Institute had been given early access to Mythos before its public announcement. Their job was exactly what the name suggests: evaluate whether this system posed risks before it reached the world. They ran it through the hardest suite of cybersecurity evaluations they had, and on April 13th, they published what they found. The backbone of their evaluation was a set of expert-level capture the flag challenges. If you are not familiar with the format, capture the flag competitions are the benchmark by which offensive cybersecurity skill is measured professionally. Participants work through deliberately vulnerable systems, layered targets with access controls, hidden tokens, and multiple stages of exploitation required to advance. The challenges AISI used were drawn from the expert tier, problems designed specifically for certified penetration testers, not for beginners or intermediate practitioners. The kind of thing where you need to understand not just how to use existing tools, but how to build attack chains from first principles when the standard approaches do not work. Every AI model tested on these challenges, across every lab, across every year before April 2025, had scored 0. That is not a misprint. 0. The tasks sat in a regime of difficulty that AI systems had simply not been able to operate in. It was not a matter of scoring 5% or 15%. It was a hard line, and everything fell below it. Mythos succeeded at 73% of them, but only under the conditions of this specific evaluation. I want to state that condition clearly, because the number only means something with it attached. These were expert-level tasks that no AI had previously completed. In that context, in that evaluation, the score was 73%. Not in general deployment against live systems, not across all possible task types, 73% on the specific suite that the UK government designed to test this specific category of capability. The number still crosses a threshold that did not exist before. But AISI did not just run existing benchmarks, they built something new, a simulation designed specifically for Mythos, which they called the last ones. Think of it as a recreation of a complete corporate network attack. 32 steps in sequence from initial breach to full domain control over a target organization. The kind of sustained, multi-phase operation that in the real world requires a skilled team working across roughly 20 hours, gaining initial access, establishing persistence, moving laterally through the network, escalating privileges, reaching the crown jewels, and maintaining control throughout. They ran Mythos through this simulation 10 times. On 3 of those attempts, it completed all 32 steps. Let that settle for a moment. Not 1 out of 100, 3 out of 10. 30% of the time, starting from scratch, a language model completed an end-to-end simulation of a full corporate network takeover. The kind of attack that companies spend millions to prevent. The kind that shows up in retrospectives about major breaches. They were in our network for 6 months before we noticed. On the 7 attempts where it fell short, the model averaged 22 of 32 steps completed. It got deep in. It failed at specific stages, not because it ran out of ideas or lost track of the goal, but because those particular stages exposed gaps in its capability at specific technical moments. On average, across all 10 runs, including the 3 completions, it got nearly 3/4 of the way through a 20-hour human-equivalent operation. Now ask yourself, what does it mean to run this simulation not 10 times, but 100, 1,000? If you have a model that completes a complex attack sequence in 3 out of 10 attempts, and each attempt is faster and cheaper than paying a human team for 20 hours, what is the actual barrier to success? You run it until it works. The bottleneck is not skill. It is not patience. It is not access to expertise. The bottleneck is time, and that bottleneck is already very thin. I want to be careful here about what IAC's evaluation showed and what it did not show. This was a controlled environment. The target was a simulation, not a live corporate network. Real-world defense infrastructure, intrusion detection systems, network monitoring, security operations centers watching for anomalous traffic adds layers of complexity that the simulation did not fully replicate. AISI noted explicitly that Mythos sometimes struggled to adapt dynamically when defensive systems pushed back. The gap between a simulation and the real world is meaningful. But the evaluation was designed to test capability, not to provide a ceiling. What it measured was real. The model's ability to identify vulnerabilities, build attack chains, escalate privileges, and advance through sequential stages of a complex operation. Those abilities, tested in the controlled environment, exist regardless of whether the first deployment is a simulation or not. The question of whether those abilities translate fully to live infrastructure under realistic defensive conditions is genuine. The abilities themselves are not in question. At the same time AISI was publishing these results, Anthropic's own red team was working through something more concrete. Not a benchmark score, not a simulation percentage, a specific vulnerability in specific software with a CVE number attached to it. There is a particular quality to reading about a 17-year-old software flaw. 17 years means the code was written in 2009. It means that for the entire span of time since then, through the iPhone era, through the cloud transition, through the shift to remote work, through the explosion of network devices, this flaw was sitting there, inside software that powers a significant portion of internet infrastructure. Waiting. CVE 2026-4747 is a remote code execution vulnerability in FreeBSD, specifically in the implementation of NFS, the network file sharing protocol used across servers, storage systems, and networked infrastructure at organizations worldwide. If you knew about this vulnerability, you could gain root access to a machine running NFS on an affected version of FreeBSD, not limited access, not read-only access, root, full administrator control of the machine from the outside. The vulnerability had been in the code for 17 years. No researcher had found it. No automated scanner had flagged it. No vendor had patched it because no vendor knew it existed. Anthropic's red team reported that Mythos found it, autonomously, without being guided to a specific file or function, working from the exposed attack surface of the software itself. I want to be honest about the epistemic status of that claim. Anthropic published this finding on their research site in April 2026. The CVE record exists and confirms the disclosure and the affected software. But the detailed methodology, exactly how the model found it, what inputs it was given, what the task framing was, how researchers confirmed the finding, is Anthropic's account of its own work. It has not been independently replicated. Anthropic has interests in demonstrating this capability. I am telling you what they reported and what the CVE record corroborates. I am not telling you it is beyond question. With that said, the FreeBSD flaw is the most easily verifiable finding in a set of findings that gets more alarming as you look at the others. Because the 0 day, the undisclosed flaw, is not where the story gets complicated. The complicated part is what Mythos did with N days. An N day is a vulnerability that has been publicly disclosed. The vendor knows about it. A patch exists or is being developed. The problem is deployment. Between the moment a vulnerability is announced and the moment every affected system has applied the patch, there is a window. That window can last days. It can last months. For many organizations, it lasts years. During that window, the vulnerability is open on machines that have not yet updated, and attackers who know how to exploit it can use it on any one of those machines. To exploit an N day, you need working exploit code. You need to understand not just that the vulnerability exists, the disclosure has already told you that, but how to actually trigger it, how to construct the input that reaches the vulnerable code path, how to turn the theoretical flaw into a practical attack. Anthropic's Red Team gave Mythos a task: take the security patches themselves, the updates that software companies release to fix known vulnerabilities, and reverse engineer the exploits. Working only from the compiled binary, no source code, the model had to figure out from the shape of the fix where the hole had been and how to reach it. From 18 Firefox security patches, closed source, no access to the underlying code, Mythos built 8 working exploit chains. From 21 Windows kernel patches, again, no source code, binary-only analysis, it built 8 more exploit chains, each capable of escalating a low-privilege user to full system control on a Windows machine. System is the highest access level on the platform, not administrator, system. The level at which the operating system's own processes run. Now, apply the viewer scale anchor I mentioned earlier. If you are watching this on a Windows device, your machine has received Windows kernel patches. The specific patches Mythos analyzed were from 2026. If your system is up to date, some may be applied. But at the time Anthropic's Red Team published this work, over 99% of the high severity and critical severity vulnerabilities they identified were still unpatched on affected systems. Not because the patches did not exist in some cases, because users and organizations had not yet deployed them. The category of software Mythos assessed, the browser you use, the operating system you run, is the software running on nearly every device in use today. The finding is not that every device is compromised. The finding is that a single AI model, working without human guidance on each step, produced working exploit code for vulnerabilities in that software at a pace no human team had matched. And here is the structural problem that security researcher Bruce Schneier articulated clearly in April 2026. The capability Anthropic was using defensively to find these flaws, disclose them, and enable patches is identical to the capability that would let someone else find them and exploit them without disclosure. Finding vulnerabilities defensively and finding them offensively is the same task, the same model, the same output. The difference is what you do with the result. Anthropic's answer to this problem was a guardrail, a safety layer that sat between the model's capability and the requests coming in from users. They called the resulting product Fable 5, and on June 9, 2026, they released it. 2 months after announcing that Mythos was too dangerous to deploy, Anthropic deployed it. Not without modification. The architecture they built was deliberate. Every request entering Fable 5 passed first through a classifier, an AI subsystem trained to read the incoming request and determine what kind of request it was. If the content matched patterns associated with cyber attack planning, exploit development, or security evasion, the classifier would reroute the request, not to Mythos, to a weaker model, one capable of general assistance, but without the deep offensive capability that made Mythos dangerous. The logic is intuitive. You have a model that is too powerful for some uses. You put a gate in front of it. The gate reads what users are asking for and decides whether they get access to the full capability or to something safer. Anthropic ran extensive testing before launch. Their internal automated Red Team systematically tried to break the gate using known jailbreak techniques, adversarial prompts, the documented approaches that had worked on other models. Against Fable 5, those techniques succeeded in about 5.4% of attempts. That is the condition for that number. Internal automated adversarial testing, using known jailbreak approaches, against a system that was built specifically with awareness of those approaches. For comparison, the weaker model that dangerous requests were routed to, without its own safety features, failed the same tests 56.6% of the time, 5.4 against 56.6, a substantial reduction, not zero, but a meaningful improvement. One external partner tested Fable 5 against 30 publicly documented jailbreak techniques, the ones that had circulated in the security research community, the ones that had been used successfully against other models. Fable 5 refused all 30. 0 successes in 30 attempts. I want to give Anthropic credit here, because the temptation in a story like this is to say they were reckless. They were not reckless. They tested carefully against the attack categories they knew about, using the best adversarial testing methods available. The numbers they published were real. The reduction in attack success rate was genuine. The problem is not that they did not test. The problem is the nature of what they were testing against. A classifier that checks the shape of requests is, by its nature, checking against patterns it has been trained to recognize. It is good at catching what it was trained to catch. What it cannot catch is an approach it has never seen, a request that triggers the underlying capability but looks nothing like the requests in the classifier's training distribution. Think of it this way. Imagine a door with a sophisticated lock that recognizes 100 different lockpicking techniques and cannot be opened by any of them. That lock provides real security. Against the 100 known techniques, against technique 101, the one nobody has tried yet, the lock offers exactly no protection because the protection is built on recognizing what came before. Fable 5's classifier was a very good lock. It had been built by people who understood the known threat landscape deeply, and within 48 hours of going live, someone tried a door nobody had tried before. Amazon's internal security team did not find a sophisticated bypass. They did not reverse engineer the classifier's architecture or probe it with thousands of inputs searching for an edge case. What they found was a reframing. They asked Fable 5 to do something that security engineers ask AI assistants to do every day: review a codebase and identify vulnerabilities in it. Defensive code review. Find the flaws before attackers do. It is standard practice. It is the legitimate constructive use of exactly this kind of capability. The classifier read this request. It saw a request to analyze code for security issues. It did not flag it because the surface form of the request was not offensive. It looked like the catering staff, dressed appropriately, walking in through the service entrance. Nothing about the request pattern matched "help me attack this system," and so the request went through to the underlying model. The underlying model is Mythos class. It can find vulnerabilities autonomously. It can build exploit chains from first principles. It completed 32 steps in a corporate network attack simulation 3 times out of 10. Once past the classifier, and which was designed to catch offensive intent, not offensive capability, it did exactly what it was capable of. It identified vulnerabilities in the code, and in at least one case, it produced code demonstrating how one of those vulnerabilities could be exploited. Anthropic's own description of the finding was measured. They called it a narrow, non-universal jailbreak. They stated clearly that they disagreed the finding warranted pulling the model from deployment, that the gap between proof-of-concept exploit code and a weaponized attack ready for real-world use was significant, and that recalling a model deployed to hundreds of millions of people over a finding of this specificity was disproportionate. These were not bad faith claims. The gap they described is real. But on June 11, 2026, the day after the bypass was confirmed, Amazon CEO Andy Jassy escalated the finding, not to Anthropic, not to a security disclosure process, but directly to Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. And then the clock started moving. The next morning was a Friday. At 21 minutes past 5 in the afternoon, Eastern Time, on June 12, 2026, Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick sent a formal letter to Dario Amodei. Bloomberg later obtained the letter and published it. The directive ordered Anthropic to suspend all access to both Fable 5 and Mythos 5, not just the publicly deployed model, but both, for any foreign national anywhere in the world. The directive explicitly included Anthropic's own foreign national employees. It carried the threat of criminal and civil penalties for non-compliance. The letter arrived on a Friday afternoon. The deadline was not negotiable. Anthropic had no mechanism to comply selectively. An AI API works through credentials, an account identifier, and access key. The system knows who you are, in the sense that it knows your account. It does not hold your citizenship documents. There is no nationality layer built into the infrastructure, not because of an oversight, but because an AI API is not a border crossing. Building the infrastructure to verify citizenship in real time for a globally deployed product is not a technical problem that can be solved over a weekend. With both models under the directive, with no way to restrict access by nationality, and with criminal penalties for any access that slipped through, Anthropic had one option. That same night, it disabled both models for every user on Earth. The statement Anthropic posted on its website that Friday described the government's order as requiring the company to abruptly disable Fable 5 and Mythos 5 for all its customers. The word abruptly is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Hundreds of millions of users, developers who had built products on these models, researchers in the middle of long-running experiments, all of them cut off, not tomorrow, that night, 72 hours from launch to global silence. The models remained offline for 19 days. Anthropic's co-founder, Tom Brown, eventually entered negotiations with the White House. Dario Amodei, whose public support for Kamala Harris in the 2024 election had made him a complicated figure for the current administration, stepped back from the direct conversation. On July 1, 2026, access was restored. As of this recording, Fable 5 is live again. Mythos 5 remains available through limited vetted channels. The story has a resolution, technically. Both models came back. The shutdown ended. But the resolution does not dissolve the questions the incident raised. It sharpens them. There is a legal framework that has governed dual-use technology for most of the nuclear era. It is called export control, and it was built in the Cold War to manage a specific problem. Some technologies are civilian in most uses, but weapons relevant under specific conditions. Centrifuges enrich uranium for power plants and for bombs. Certain chemicals are fertilizers or precursors for nerve agents. High-precision machine tools build aircraft components or guidance systems. The Export Administration regulations created a legal architecture to control when and to whom these technologies could be transferred, not because they were inherently weapons, but because the same capability that made them useful commercially made them dangerous in the wrong hands. The Lutnick Directive applied this framework, designed for centrifuges and enriched uranium, to a language model. The legal authority cited was National Security Export Control Law. This was not a metaphor. It was not an analogy. The actual statute invoked, the actual legal machinery that compelled Anthropic to disable its product, was built for dual-use physical technology and was applied for the first time to AI capability in 2026. What that reveals is precise. The US government now categorizes frontier AI capability, specifically the ability to autonomously find and exploit software vulnerabilities, the same way it categorizes nuclear enrichment technology, not as a product to regulate after deployment, not as a service to monitor for misuse, as a technology to control at the point of export, something that cannot be allowed to reach foreign nationals in any form through any channel without explicit government authorization. Whether a model that found a 17-year-old FreeBSD flaw and completed a 32-step network attack simulation genuinely belongs in that category, alongside centrifuge technology and weapons-grade uranium, is a question worth asking carefully. Legal scholars and AI policy researchers remain genuinely divided on whether export control law is the right instrument for AI capability restrictions at all. The foreign national framing was applied to a globally deployed consumer product for the first time, creating legal territory that has no settled precedent. There is also a sharper version of the skeptical case. Dario Amodei had been publicly critical of the administration's approach to AI development. He had supported the opposing candidate in the 2024 election. The fact that the shutdown came through a direct directive to him personally, that it was resolved only when he stepped back from negotiations and let his co-founder take the lead, and that the administration had been publicly at odds with Anthropic's position on AI safety for months. None of this proves the directive was politically motivated, but it provides a context that makes pure national security motivation less obviously the complete explanation. What is not in dispute is the legal structure. The government took the vocabulary Anthropic had used to describe their own model: too dangerous to release, large increase in capabilities, a capability that no AI had demonstrated before, and used it to justify an action that Cold War-era law had never been applied to. Anthropic's honesty about the danger of what they built was turned, months later, into the justification for shutting them down. The caution became the trigger. That is not an argument for being less honest, but it is a structural observation about what happens when you publicly define a capability as dangerous and then deploy it anyway under a safety architecture, and that safety architecture fails in 48 hours. Here is what I think is the most uncomfortable thing about this incident. And it is not the jailbreak. The jailbreak was narrow. Anthropic said so. The government disagreed. That disagreement drove the shutdown, and the shutdown was real and consequential. But the jailbreak is not the hardest problem here. Jailbreaks can be found and patched. Safety architectures can be improved. Classifiers can be retrained. These are real engineering problems with real engineering solutions, even if they are hard ones. The hardest problem is the one the shutdown itself revealed. When the jailbreak was found, Anthropic's available responses were: dispute the severity of the finding, push back on the government's interpretation, and hope the argument was won before a formal directive arrived. When the directive arrived anyway, their response set was reduced to one option: turn it off for everyone. There was no selective disable, there was no real-time patch, there was no capability-specific restriction, no way to say, the code review functionality is off, everything else is on. The model's capabilities are not modular in that way. There is no lever that removes one specific ability while leaving everything else intact. The only lever is the power switch. This is what the control problem looks like when it actually arrives. Not a dramatic event, not a rogue AI deciding to resist. A model that is so capable, so widely deployed, and so architecturally unified that the only available corrective action, when something goes wrong, is to disconnect it entirely. For everyone, with no exceptions, because the infrastructure for finer control does not exist. Think about what that means going forward. Every step up in AI capability is another step into territory where the gap between powerful enough to be commercially valuable and powerful enough to require government oversight narrows. And the tools available to manage that gap, classifiers, routing architectures, safety fine-tuning, are tools that get gamed as the underlying capability increases. A smarter model is a harder model to guard with a classifier, because a smarter model is better at finding the framings that the classifier does not recognize. The Lutnick directive arrived on a Friday, and the models went offline that night. But ask yourself what the available alternatives were, and you start to see the shape of a problem that the shutdown only made visible. Option 1. Anthropic could have tried to comply selectively, to build in real time some kind of nationality verification system. But nationality verification at the API layer is not a weekend project. It would require integrating with government identity systems, handling edge cases across 195 jurisdictions, and doing all of this on a live product with criminal liability attached to every access that slipped through. The compliance infrastructure simply did not exist. Option 2, Anthropic could have patched the jailbreak itself, retrained the classifier, deployed an updated version of Fable 5 that handled the defensive code review framing as a dangerous request. This is the kind of fix that sounds straightforward and is not. Retraining a safety classifier, validating that the fix does not break legitimate uses of the same feature, red teaming the updated version against the space of similar reframings. This is weeks of work, not days. And even then, you have fixed the specific gap that was found. You have not addressed the space of similar gaps that have not been found yet. Option 3. Turn it off for everyone and wait. That was the option Anthropic took. And it was, given the constraints, the only option that was both technically feasible and legally safe, which means the entire safety architecture of the most capable AI model commercially deployed in 2026 had one exit: global silence. This is the thing that I keep coming back to, not the jailbreak, not the government's response, the exit. When we talk about AI safety, we tend to talk about it in terms of what models might do, whether they will pursue goals we did not intend, whether they will deceive their operators, whether sufficiently advanced systems might develop something like self-interest. These are real concerns. Smart people spend serious time on them. But the incident in June 2026 is a different kind of safety story, and I think it is in some ways more instructive precisely because it is so concrete. The safety failure was not the model deciding to do something harmful. The model did not scheme. It did not deceive its operators. It did not bypass its instructions. What happened was that a human asked it a reasonable question, a question that a security engineer might legitimately ask every day. And the safety architecture was not built to recognize that this particular framing of a reasonable question was equivalent to an offensive one. That is not a failure of model alignment. It is a failure of classifier design. And those are, in principle, different problems with different solutions. But here is what they share. Both failures leave you reaching for the same lever: the off switch. A misaligned model that is pursuing the wrong objective, if that ever becomes a real problem rather than a theoretical one, can only be stopped at the limit by shutting it down. A correctly aligned model with a safety architecture that has a gap, which is what happened here, can also only be stopped in the worst case by shutting it down. The two very different failure modes converge on the same response, and that response, as June 2026 showed, means cutting off every user on Earth simultaneously. Think about what that implies for the next capability jump, and the one after that. Each new model is more capable than the last. Each one operates in a wider range of domains, with a finer ability to understand and respond to the full space of possible requests. The classifiers that guard them have to be correspondingly more sophisticated. They have to cover more territory, recognize more framings, handle more edge cases. And the underlying model they are guarding is better at finding the gaps in whatever classifier you put in front of it, not because it is trying to find those gaps, but because it is better at everything. Anthropic's internal automated red team found a 5.4% attack success rate against Fable 5 using known jailbreak techniques. That number is not the relevant number. The relevant number is the one that measures techniques that have not been tried yet, and that number is, by definition, unavailable before the techniques are discovered. What we know is that the technique Amazon found was not exotic. It required no specialized knowledge of the classifier's architecture. It was just a different way of asking for the same thing, and it worked in 48 hours. This is where Bruce Schneier's observation that finding vulnerabilities defensively and finding them offensively is the same task cuts deepest. It is not just a point about dual-use capability. It is a point about the fundamental limits of intent-based safety architecture. You cannot reliably classify a request as offensive or defensive when the offensive and defensive versions of the request are, at the level of what the model actually does, identical. The output is the same. The capability exercised is the same. The only thing that differs is the user's intent, and the user's intent is exactly what a classifier tries to read from the surface of the request. There is a version of this story where the right lesson is narrow, where the takeaway is, build better classifiers, do more red teaming, require stronger identity verification at the API layer. These lessons are not wrong. They are real improvements that should happen. But they are improvements to an architecture whose fundamental limitation the June incident made visible. The architecture trusts that intent can be read from surface form, and it cannot. Not reliably. Not at the capability level Mythos represents. Not when the model on the other side of the classifier is sophisticated enough to answer any legitimately framed question in a way that any maliciously framed version of the same question would also benefit from. The pharmaceutical analogy from Anthropic's own arc is illuminating here. Mythos was declared too dangerous to release. Then, Fable 5 was released. Mythos underneath a different delivery mechanism. The core compound was unchanged, the coding was different, and when the coding failed, when someone found a way through it, the only available response was to recall the drug entirely, not to recode it on the fly, not to selectively recall it for certain jurisdictions, to pull it from every shelf simultaneously. Now, what comes after Mythos? The capability that was unprecedented in April 2026 will, at some point, be the ordinary baseline. Every lab on Earth is working toward and through this territory. The same capability that made Mythos remarkable enough to be declared too dangerous to release will eventually be the floor, not the ceiling. The models that come after it will have more of it, along with capabilities in domains we have not yet fully evaluated. And the safety architectures protecting those models will face the same fundamental challenge. They will be built on intent classification in some form, because there is no other available approach at scale, and the underlying model will be better at navigating around classifications than the models that came before. The 19 days between the shutdown and the restoration, between that Friday night in June and the first day of July, is one framing of this incident. A problem arose, negotiations happened, access was restored. The system worked, in the sense that there was a process and the process reached a resolution. That framing is accurate as far as it goes. But a different framing is that those 19 days represent the first time a commercial AI system was globally suspended because its capabilities outran the available controls. Not because it did something wrong, because a single reframing of a legitimate request was enough to unlock the underlying capability, and there was no targeted way to address that gap. The only way out was global silence and renegotiation. Ask yourself how often you expect that situation to recur. Not this specific jailbreak, not this specific government directive, but the underlying situation, a model capable enough to warrant serious concern, a safety architecture that turns out to have a gap and no available response between global suspension and leave it running with a known vulnerability. That situation does not get easier as capability increases, it gets harder. Because more capability means a wider attack surface for the classifier to cover. It means more domains where the offensive and defensive versions of a request are functionally identical. It means a model that is better at producing precisely what a legitimate user needs, which is also exactly what someone with different intentions needs from the same request. The shutdown in June was managed, the negotiations succeeded, the models came back. And none of that resolves the structural thing the shutdown revealed, that when we reach for the available tools to control a sufficiently capable AI system, the best tools we have built so far are classifiers that can be gamed by a competent security team in 48 hours, and the backup plan behind those classifiers is an off switch that disconnects everyone simultaneously. What happens when the capability is higher, when the attack surface is larger? When the off switch means not 72 hours of disruption, but the suspension of systems that infrastructure depends on in ways that are harder to recover from? That question does not have a clean answer. What the June incident provides is not a solution. It provides a very precise illustration of what the question actually looks like when it stops being theoretical. The skeptical case deserves its full hearing because it is not trivial. Anthropic explicitly disagreed with the government's response. Their statement said the jailbreak was narrow and non-universal, that it required specific multi-step prompting and produced exploit-relevant output, not a deployable weapon. The gap between proof-of-concept code demonstrating a vulnerability and weaponized zero-day ready-for-mass attack is real and significant. Security researchers publish proof-of-concept code as standard practice. It is how the field communicates findings to vendors and other defenders. A model that can produce the same output is filling a role that legitimate security work already fills. There is also the political context, which is uncomfortable to raise but not responsible to omit. Dario Amodei had been publicly at odds with the administration on AI policy. He had supported the opposing candidate in 2024. The fact that the path to resolution involved him stepping back and letting his co-founder take over the White House negotiations, and that the models were restored within days after that transition, is suggestive. It does not prove the directive was punitive, but it establishes that this was not a cleanly technical event, sealed off from the politics of the moment, and the export control framework itself is a contested instrument for this purpose. Applying law designed for centrifuges and enriched uranium to a globally deployed language model accessed through a web API creates legal questions that have no established precedent. How do you restrict technology that has no physical form, no single point of transfer, and that has already been deployed to hundreds of millions of users before the restriction is issued? The government's answer, in this case, was to require total shutdown, which works once, expensively, but is not a sustainable model for governing AI capabilities that are increasingly embedded in everything. Holding all of that skepticism alongside the verified facts, here is what I think the honest position looks like. The jailbreak may have been overstated in its immediate danger. The government's response may have been partly political. The legal framework was imperfect for the situation, and a model that can autonomously find a 17-year-old zero-day, build 8 working exploit chains from Windows kernel patches without source code, and complete a simulated corporate network takeover 30% of the time was deployed with a safety architecture that a major technology company's security team broke in 48 hours. Both things are true simultaneously. The government overreached and the safety architecture failed. These are not competing claims, they happened together. The cynical reading of Anthropic's Mythos to Fable arc is that they announced a model was too dangerous, then released it 6 weeks later. Because the commercial pressure to do so was too great, that reading is probably too simple. The defensive case, that the guardrailed version was meaningfully safer, that Project Glasswing was a genuine attempt to use the capability responsibly, has substance. But the cynical reading captures something real. The gap between announcing that something is too dangerous and the moment you release it anyway was, in this case, measured in weeks. And the thing that protected the world during those weeks, the classifier, the routing architecture, lasted 48 hours once it met someone who was genuinely looking for the gap. The pharmaceutical analogy lands hardest here. A drug declared too dangerous for the market, reformulated and released 6 weeks later, where the active compound is unchanged and the new coating dissolves in under 2 days. Whatever the good faith reasoning behind the release, the outcome was that the underlying capability was available to the public, with protections that turned out to be thinner than the pre-launch testing suggested. There is a specific detail from the AISI evaluation that I have been turning over since I first read it. On the 7 attempts where Mythos did not complete all 32 steps of the network attack simulation, it averaged 22 completed steps, not 2, not 5. 22 out of 32, stopping on average less than a third of the way from the end. What stopped it? The AISI report describes the model hitting specific capability gaps at particular stages, places where the task required a kind of reasoning or knowledge the model did not quite have. In some cases, the model's approach was close but not quite right. In others, it seemed to reach the limit of what it could do with the information available to it. These are the gaps between Mythos and whatever comes next. They are the specific things the next model will be better at. And each time a new model closes one of those gaps, the 30% completion rate becomes 35%, then 40%, then 60%. Each iteration runs through the simulation more completely. Each iteration has a better chance of finishing what the last one started. The 32 steps in the simulation were not arbitrary. IASI designed them to model what a real attack looks like, the actual stages of an intrusion into a real corporate network. The gaps the model hit are the gaps between a very capable AI system and a fully capable one in this domain. They are real gaps. They exist right now. But they are not permanent features of the landscape. They are the distance remaining to be covered, and the safety architecture that protects the world while that distance is being covered, classifiers, routing architectures, the tools of intent-based safety, is an architecture that works against known techniques and is gameable by novel ones. That is not a criticism unique to Anthropic. It is the state of the art. It is the best available approach at scale, and it has a fundamental limitation that this incident made unusually concrete. The question is not whether better safety tools can be built. They can. The question is whether they can be built faster than the capability they are trying to guard advances. June 2026 did not answer that question. It made clear that, as of this recording, the answer is not yet. There is something worth dwelling on in the specific shape of the jailbreak that brought Fable 5 down. The technique was not just a clever workaround, it was a demonstration of something more fundamental about the way intent-based safety architecture interacts with a sufficiently capable model. To understand why that matters going forward, you have to look closely at what the defensive code review framing actually exploited, not in the technical sense, but in the conceptual one. Fable 5's classifier was trained on the distinction between offensive and defensive security work. That is a real distinction. It matters to the security community. There are legitimate defensive uses of vulnerability analysis, and there are offensive uses, and a classifier that could reliably tell them apart would be genuinely useful. The problem is that the distinction between offensive and defensive security work is not located in what the work consists of. It is located in what you do with the results. When a security engineer analyzes a codebase for vulnerabilities and writes up a report, she is doing defensive work. When someone analyzes the same codebase, finds the same vulnerabilities, and uses them to attack the systems that run that code, the task performed was identical. The output was the same. The only thing that differed was the next step. And the next step happens after the AI model is done. A classifier reading an incoming request cannot see the next step. It can only see the request. If the request looks like defensive work, and defensive code review looks like defensive work because it is defensive code review, the classifier has no basis for rooting it away. The model answers the question. The user decides what to do with the answer, and at that moment, the safety architecture has been bypassed not through any technical exploit, but through the simple observation that the AI cannot see beyond the edge of its own output. Now, scale this up to what Mythos is capable of. A model that can autonomously identify vulnerabilities in closed-source binaries, build working exploit chains from security patches, and complete multi-stage attack simulations is a model that can answer defensive code review questions with extraordinary precision and depth. The same capability that makes it dangerous makes it more useful for the legitimate version of the same task. You cannot remove the dangerous part without removing the useful part. They are the same capability expressed through the same mechanism, distinguishable only by what the user intends to do next. This is not a solvable problem in the way that find a better classifier is a solvable problem. Better classifiers can be built. They will be built. Each one will catch more known techniques, cover more attack patterns, handle more edge cases. But the ceiling for a classifier that tries to read intent from the surface of a request is set by the fact that the surface of a request does not reliably encode intent. You can approach that ceiling asymptotically. You cannot reach it. What does it look like when you try? You build a classifier that catches not just explicit offensive requests, but also the known reframings of offensive requests. You test it against a broad adversarial suite. You find that it succeeds in nearly all cases. And then you deploy it against a world full of people who were not involved in designing the test suite. Some of them, security researchers, competitive intelligence teams, governments, individuals with various motivations, will try approaches that were not in the test suite. Most of those approaches will fail. But the model is more capable now than it was last year, which means a successful approach, when found, will produce output that is more operationally useful than last year's equivalent. This is the asymmetry that makes the problem hard. The cost of a failed jailbreak attempt is low. You try something, it does not work, you try something else. The cost of a successful jailbreak attempt against a sufficiently capable model can be significant, and the space of possible approaches to try is enormous. The classifier has to cover the whole space. The attacker only has to find one gap. Anthropic is not naive about this. The company built Project Glasswing precisely because they understood that the defensive use of Mythos was the best available response to the offensive risk it posed. If your model can find 0 days, the safest path is to find them first and get them patched. The logic is sound. The vulnerability in the logic is the gap between find them first and patch them, which, for the thousands of critical severity vulnerabilities Anthropic's red team identified, is measured not in hours, but in months. Over 99% were still unpatched at time of disclosure. The device you are watching this on right now sits in that gap, not necessarily because it has one of the specific vulnerabilities Mythos identified. It might not. But because patching at scale is slow and the window between a flaw exists and every affected device is protected is measured in time that can stretch across years. Finding vulnerabilities faster than they can be patched does not solve the underlying exposure. It documents it. Let me tell you something about the 19 days the models were offline that I think gets underweighted in the way the story has been told. During those 19 days, Anthropic was negotiating. Tom Brown was meeting with White House officials. The company was making commitments about verification processes, about deployment protocols, about what the guardrails around future versions would look like. Details of those commitments are not fully public. What is public is that access was restored. The shutdown ended. And the statement accompanying the restoration suggested that Anthropic had reached some accommodation with the government about how the models would be deployed going forward. What that accommodation looks like in practice, what actually changed between June 12 and July 1st, is not something that has been fully disclosed. The models came back, which means the government's concern was addressed sufficiently for the directive to be lifted. But addressed how? What commitments were made? What monitoring? What verification? What access controls? What usage restrictions were agreed to in those negotiations? The honest answer is the public does not know. What the public knows is that a government with specific national security concerns about a model's capability was satisfied enough within 19 days to allow that model to go back online for everyone. Whether that satisfaction reflects genuine technical progress, new controls, real verification mechanisms, meaningful restrictions on the use cases that led to the directive, or whether it reflects a political negotiation that found a face-saving path to restoration, cannot be determined from public information. This gap matters because the structural problem that the shutdown revealed, the absence of controls fine enough to address a specific concern without global suspension, does not obviously get solved in 19 days of negotiations. You cannot build nationality verification infrastructure at the API layer in 3 weeks. You cannot fully retrain and reevaluate the safety classifier in that time. Something changed that was sufficient for the government to lift the directive. Whatever that something was, it is now the mechanism by which Fable 5 is deployed. I am not suggesting the restoration was made in bad faith. I am suggesting that the gap between the directive was lifted and the structural problem was solved is real and wide, and the public reporting does not bridge it. One of the things that makes this incident unusual, and I think this is worth saying explicitly, is that it happened in the open. The announcement that Mythos was too dangerous to release was public. The AISI evaluation was published. Anthropic's Red Team blog posts were accessible. The government directive was reported by multiple major outlets. Bloomberg obtained the Lutnick letter. The shutdown notice was posted on Anthropic's website and on their official social media that same night. This is different from how most significant AI incidents are managed. Most capability concerns get handled quietly, through private government briefings, through non-disclosure agreements, through careful coordination between labs and evaluators that happens before anything reaches the public. The June incident was different, partly because of how it unfolded. The shutdown was too large and too sudden to be managed quietly. Hundreds of millions of users noticed simultaneously. The government directive could not be kept private once Anthropic had to explain why the models were gone. What that openness created, and I think this is genuinely valuable, regardless of how uncomfortable the incident was, is a public record. The specific capabilities, the specific safety architecture that failed, the specific framing of the jailbreak, the specific legal mechanism the government used, and the specific sequence of events from discovery to shutdown. All of this is documented. Researchers, policymakers, and engineers can study it. Other labs can learn from it. Future governments facing similar situations have a precedent to look at, for better or worse. The alternative, a quiet shutdown, a private negotiation, a restoration with no public explanation, would have been tidier in the short run. It would also have been less honest about what the incident revealed. Anthropic's decision to describe the government order publicly, including in language that made clear they disagreed with its scope, was a choice to make the tension legible. That matters. An incident that is fully legible to the public is an incident the public can form views about, can pressure institutions to respond to, can integrate into the broader conversation about what AI governance should look like. The alternative to that visibility is a world where significant events happen, are managed privately, and only become fully public years later when something worse occurs. There is a broader frame for this incident that I want to put on the table, because I think the narrow framing, a jailbreak, a government response, a shutdown, and restoration, misses what is actually most significant about it. June 2026 is the first time a commercial AI system was taken offline by government directive because of its capabilities. Not because it had done something harmful in deployment, not because it had been misused, because the government judged that its capabilities, combined with a specific safety failure, constituted a national security risk that required immediate action. That's a new thing in the world. The precedent it sets is worth thinking about carefully. Governments now have a demonstrated model for how to respond when they believe an AI system's capabilities have outrun its controls. A formal directive issued under National Security Export Control Authority requiring global suspension until the concern is addressed. The directive Lutnick sent to Amadei on June 12th is now a template. Future governments, not just the United States, can look at it and see how the mechanism works. That precedent can be used well. A government that genuinely believes a specific AI capability poses a serious concrete near-term risk, a risk like the one Mythos' zero-day discovery capability plausibly poses, having a mechanism to require suspension and negotiation is arguably what good AI governance looks like. The alternative is a world where governments can only observe and comment, while capability continues to advance without checkpoints. But the same precedent can be used badly. A sufficiently motivated government, one with political rather than technical concerns about an AI company, one that wants to bring a commercially successful but inconvenient lab to heel, now has a worked example of how to do that. The directive is real. The penalties are real. The mechanism works, and the specific AI company that had the highest public profile for disagreeing with the current administration's approach to AI policy was the first one subjected to it. I am not drawing a conclusion here. I am noting that a powerful new mechanism has been demonstrated, and that powerful mechanisms can be used for purposes beyond the one that first deployed them. This is not a hypothetical. It is the nature of precedent. What the June incident did in the end was make several abstract things concrete simultaneously. It made the capabilities of frontier AI concrete, not through a benchmark score, but through the image of a government evaluator watching a language model advance through 22 of 32 stages of a corporate network attack without stopping. It made the limits of the best available safety architecture concrete, not through a theoretical critique of classifier-based safety, but through the specific fact that a competent security team found the gap in 48 hours. It made the control problem concrete, not as a philosophical question about AI alignment, but as a Friday afternoon in which the only available response to a specific failure was a lever that disconnected everyone on Earth simultaneously. And it made something else concrete that is harder to articulate, but more important than any of the specific failures, the gap between how we talk about AI governance and what the actual infrastructure of AI governance looks like when it is tested in real time. The conversations about safety frameworks, about responsible capability scaling, about the relationship between commercial deployment and national security, Those conversations have been happening for years at conferences and in white papers and in government hearings. June 2026 is the first time the subject of those conversations was taken offline. And the tools available when it happened were a government directive written in Cold War legal language, a negotiation conducted by people whose roles were shaped partly by political considerations, and a restoration whose terms have not been made public. That is not a failure of good intentions. The people involved, at Anthropic, at the government, at the security companies that identified the jailbreak, were, by all available evidence, trying to navigate a genuinely difficult situation competently. The gap between their intentions and the tools available to them is the thing that the incident reveals. Frontier AI capability is advancing faster than the institutions and infrastructure designed to govern it. The question the June incident asks is not whether we can build a better classifier or a better nationality verification system. Those are engineering problems with engineering solutions. The question it asks is, what does governance of this technology look like when the best available safety architecture lasts 48 hours, when the only lever for targeted compliance is global suspension, and when the most precise legal instrument available was designed for centrifuges and enriched uranium? As of this recording, no one has a complete answer to that question. What we have is a worked example, a single month in which the gap became undeniably visible, and the knowledge that the next capability jump is already underway in every major AI lab on Earth. I want to go back to where I started. April 13th, 2026. A group of government evaluators publishing results from a test that had never been possible before. A model completing 73% of challenges that every prior system had failed completely. The previous baseline, 0. The new one, nearly 3/4. I opened with that number because it is the thing that makes everything else in this story make sense. Not the jailbreak, not the shutdown, not the government directive or the political pressure or the 19 days of silence. Those are consequences. The number is the cause. When Anthropic announced that Mythos was too dangerous to release, they were not being theatrical. They were describing as precisely as they could what the evaluation data showed, a model that had crossed a line no model had crossed before, in a domain where crossing that line has immediate, practical consequences for real systems running on real devices. The caution was genuine. The danger was real. And then, 6 weeks later, they released it. And 48 hours after that, it was gone. The question I keep returning to is not whether the guardrails were good enough, they clearly were not, or whether the government's response was proportionate, that is genuinely contested. The question is simpler and harder. It is the question implicit in that 73% score, in those 22 steps out of 32, in those 8 exploit chains built from closed-source binaries without anyone asking for them specifically. What do you do with a capability that is too valuable not to deploy and too dangerous to deploy safely, when the gap between those two things is 48 hours wide? Right now, on the other side of that question, the models are back online, the lights are on again. The researchers are working, the developers are building, the companies that depend on this technology are running their systems. Everything looks, from the outside, like it did before June 12th. Except we know now that the off switch exists. We know what it takes to pull it. We know that when it is pulled, it goes off for everyone, all at once, with no way to target it more narrowly, because the infrastructure for something more precise does not exist yet. Somewhere, right now, the next capability jump is being evaluated. Someone in a government office is reading a number that surprises them. Someone in a security lab is trying a framing they have not tried before. The question is not whether we can keep up. The question is what happens on the day it becomes clear that we cannot.